Relax, Mark. We finally cleaned up that mosquito swamp for you.
The HOA waited until I left town, then sent bulldozers across my property line and dumped 37 truckloads of fill into part of 1.6 acres of protected wetland. By the time I came home, the cattails were gone. In their place was a brand new tennis court. Then the rain came. With the natural drainage buried, water backed across one of the HOA's main access roads and forced them to close the entrance. Diane Mercer, the HOA president, called it an unexpected drainage issue. I didn't. I'm a retired civil engineer, and sitting in my office were the deed, survey, wetland delineation, and drainage records showing exactly what she had paved over. So I didn't argue. I photographed everything and opened a file. If you enjoy watching bullies lose to paperwork and the law, subscribe. Because when investigators started pulling Diane's emails, the $500,000 tennis court wasn't the worst thing they found. I got home at 4:18 on a Thursday afternoon. Before I even reached the house, I knew something had changed. The back of my property was too bright. For more than 30 years, that corner had been cattails, sedge grass, shallow water, dark soil, and a natural drainage channel that carried runoff toward Miller Creek. Now there was a rectangle of fresh black asphalt surrounded by a 6-foot green fence, 2 tennis nets, 4 benches, and a new sign bolted beside the gate: Ridgeview Community Tennis Courts. Diane was standing inside with 3 board members: white jacket, designer sunglasses, clipboard. She saw my truck and walked toward me like she was expecting congratulations. "Relax, Mark. We finally cleaned up that mosquito swamp for you." I didn't answer. I walked the perimeter. The paved pad covered roughly 8,000 square feet, but the disturbed area extended beyond it. Vegetation had been stripped. Fill had been compacted into the drainage channel. The original grade was gone. Then I saw something near the southeast corner, about 2 inches of orange plastic sticking out beneath the new gravel base. I knelt and brushed the loose stone away. It was one of the wetland boundary stakes. The contractor hadn't failed to see the marker. They had paved over it. I stood up. "Who authorized this?" Diane tapped her clipboard. "The board." I looked at the orange stake, then at her. "The board doesn't own this land." That was the first time Diane stopped smiling. The wetland had been part of my family's property since 1987, long before Ridgeview existed. Back then there was no stone entrance, no clubhouse, no HOA board, and certainly no tennis court. Just woods, pasture, Miller Creek, and a low section of ground that collected stormwater before releasing it slowly downstream. My father, Walter, had been a heavy equipment mechanic. He wasn't an environmental scientist. He just understood land. Developers tried twice to buy that section of the parcel from him. He refused both times. He used to tell me, "People only notice wetlands after they're gone." When he died, the property passed to me. I kept every document: the original deed, 2 boundary surveys, old drainage drawings, and the wetland delineation completed years earlier when Ridgeview expanded toward our property line. That evening, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. I compared the recorded survey with the current parcel map and the location of the new court. This wasn't a contractor missing the boundary by 2 feet. It wasn't 10 feet. A major portion of the court and nearly the entire filled area sat inside my parcel. I checked the measurements 3 times. In 31 years as a civil engineer, I had worked on projects where a few inches on a drawing could stop millions of dollars in construction. This wasn't inches. Someone had treated a property line like it was optional. And the next morning I went to find out who. Diane was already at the HOA office. She had a binder open on the conference table and a printed resolution waiting for me. Community Health and Recreation Improvement Initiative. According to Diane, the wetland created mosquito concerns, lowered nearby property values, and prevented Ridgeview from using an underutilized portion of the neighborhood. I read the document twice. No parcel number. No easement. No deed transfer. No environmental approval. Nothing showing the HOA had any legal interest in my property. I put it back on the table. Where does this authorize you to build on my land? Diane folded her hands. Mark, you live adjacent to Ridgeview. Sometimes individual preferences have to give way to the greater good. This isn't a preference. It's a property line. The board approved the project. That was when I noticed the signature page. 7 board positions were listed. Only one signature appeared beneath the authorization. Diane Mercer, HOA President. And beside her signature were 2 words: Emergency Remediation. I asked what emergency required 37 loads of fill, asphalt paving, fencing, benches, and tennis nets, while I happened to be out of state. She didn't answer. Instead, she said, "You should be grateful. Your property looks better now." I asked for a copy of the resolution. Diane handed it to me like she believed the paper protected her. It did something more useful. It showed me exactly where to start looking. I didn't call her again. I didn't threaten the contractor. I didn't touch the fence. And I didn't damage 1 square inch of the tennis court. I went home and started a file. First, I photographed the site. Every fence post. Every drainage outlet. Every edge of the asphalt. Every place fill extended beyond the paved pad. Then I checked the grade. In some locations, the contractor had raised the surface by nearly 28 inches. That explained the flooding. Water that had once spread into the wetland now hit a compacted wall of soil, crushed stone, and asphalt. But the best evidence wasn't on the ground. It was on a trail camera behind my equipment shed. I had installed it months earlier because someone kept removing private property signs near the back of the parcel. The camera had recorded almost the entire construction sequence. Day 1-2 survey workers entered. Day 2, dump trucks arrived. Day 3, a bulldozer began pushing fill into the wetland. Day 4, the base was compacted. Day 5, paving started. Then I found the clip that mattered. At 10:43 on Tuesday morning, one worker stopped beside an orange wetland marker. He pointed at it. A few minutes later, Diane walked into the frame. They spoke for less than a minute. The worker looked at the marker again, then climbed back into the machine. The next pass buried it. There was no audio, but the camera recorded Diane, the operator, the contractor logo, the truck numbers, and the exact time. I made 3 copies. One on my computer, one on an external drive, one stored off-site. By then, I wasn't trying to prove somebody made a mistake. I was trying to determine whether they had been warned before they made it. The contractor was Northridge Site Works. I called at 8:12 the next morning. A supervisor named Kevin answered. I gave him my parcel number. "Who told you that property belonged to Ridgeview?" There was a pause. "We were contracted by the HOA. They represented the site as community property." I emailed him the recorded survey. 6 minutes later, he called me back. His voice had changed. He asked where I got the map. The county recorder. Then I asked the question I actually cared about. What environmental authorization were you given before placing fill in the wetland? Kevin paused again. That's between us and the client. 2 hours later, I received an email. Please direct all future communications regarding the project through Ridgeview HOA Council. That told me enough. By noon, Diane had responded too, not with an apology. With a certified letter accusing me of harassing HOA contractors, interfering with community improvements, and creating a hostile environment for board volunteers. She warned that further contact could result in legal action. I read it once, then filed it behind her emergency remediation resolution. That afternoon, I reviewed the trail camera footage again and counted every truck. 37 loads. That wasn't a landscaping crew wandering across the wrong boundary. Someone scheduled those trucks. Someone approved those invoices. Someone told Northridge the land was theirs to use. And now Northridge didn't want to talk. So I stopped looking at the construction site and started looking at the records. Years earlier, when Ridgeview expanded toward us, the wetland had been formally mapped as part of a drainage review. I had my father's copy, but I wanted the public record. I pulled the county files, old site plans, drainage records, environmental documents tied to the parcel. Then I laid them beside a current aerial image. The boundaries matched. The orange stakes Northridge had buried weren't random survey flags. They followed the same documented wetland line shown in the old delineation, and the tennis court ran directly across it. I checked Diane's resolution again. No wetland reference. No environmental review. No permit number. Nothing suggesting anyone had asked whether those 37 loads of material could legally be placed there. There's something you learn after 3 decades in civil engineering. You can argue about landscaping. You can argue about aesthetics. You can even argue about what makes a neighborhood look expensive. But you cannot make drainage disappear by changing what you call it. So I assembled a package. The deed. Recorded survey. Wetland map. Before and after photographs. Trail camera timestamps. And Diane's signed emergency remediation document. Then I submitted the package to the appropriate environmental authorities. I didn't warn Diane. 3 days later, my phone rang at 9:17 in the morning. The caller confirmed the parcel number, then asked, "Mr. Ellison, is the fill material still in place?" I looked out my kitchen window. 2 residents were playing tennis. Fresh white lines. New nets. Black asphalt covering the ground my father had protected for decades. Yes. All of it. There was a pause. Then, "Do you know who authorized the work?" I looked at Diane's signature. "Yes. I believe I do." At 7:26 that evening, Rachel Kim knocked on my door. Rachel was the HOA secretary. Quiet. Precise. The kind of person who recorded meeting minutes exactly as people said things and left before the arguing started. I had spoken to her maybe 6 times in 3 years. That night she carried a manila envelope. "I think you need to see this." We sat at the kitchen table. Inside were printed emails, meeting notes, and contractor invoices. The first thing I noticed was simple. The board had never voted to build a tennis court on my property. They had discussed mosquito control, a drainage review, possible recreation upgrades, but there was no recorded vote authorizing construction on my parcel. Rachel pointed to one email from Diane. "Mark has already objected to the use of that area. Do not contact him directly. Route everything through me." I read it twice. That sentence mattered more than anything Diane had said in her office. She knew I objected. She knew there was a property dispute, and she specifically told the contractor not to speak with me. Rachel kept going. The original site work proposal was $118,400. The invoices already exceeded $203,000. Why the increase? I asked the same question. Then she pulled out a marketing draft. Ridgeview Lifestyle Upgrade, Summer Launch. Across the top, new private tennis amenity, opening this season. The document had been created 3 weeks before construction began. This wasn't emergency remediation. The next file made that even clearer. A real estate marketing company had prepared material for several Ridgeview homeowners. The tennis court was the centerpiece. Not mosquito control. Not drainage. A sales feature. The proposal estimated that additional recreational amenities could support listing prices 6 to 9% higher for the homes closest to the new court. Diane's name appeared throughout the email chain. She had been pushing to complete the court before the summer listings went live. That explained the schedule, the rush, and the phrase she used constantly. Property values. The wetland wasn't a health emergency. It was standing where Diane wanted a marketing photograph. The next morning, Tom Alvarez stopped by. Tom lived 2 houses inside Ridgeview and had spent 38 years operating excavators and graders. He had watched North Ridge enter my property. I asked Diane if you knew what they were doing. What did she tell you? Tom looked toward the court. She said you'd complain, then get over it. Tom had taken 23 photographs, truck numbers, equipment, workers, and one clear image of Diane standing beside the first load of fill before it was dumped. By then, the timeline was difficult to explain away. Diane knew I objected. She controlled communications with North Ridge. She wanted the project completed before the sales campaign, and she had been physically present when the first load arrived. But Rachel still hadn't shown me the email that bothered her most. When I asked why, she stared at her screen. Because this one proves she knew exactly when you'd be gone. She forwarded it at 8:03 the next morning. The subject line was ordinary. Schedule confirmation. Most of the email dealt with delivery windows, equipment access, and fence installation. Then I reached the final paragraph. Mark will be out of state until next Thursday. Get the fill in before he comes back. Once the site is graded, there won't be anything left for him to argue about. I read it 3 times, then printed it. No angry response. No phone call. I added it to the file. That email closed the only explanations Diane still had. She couldn't say she thought I agreed. She couldn't say she didn't know there was a dispute. And she couldn't say the timing was accidental. She had waited until I was gone, then ordered the part of the job that would be hardest to reverse, the fill. That afternoon, the investigator received the email too. I still didn't contact Diane. There was no reason to. She thought the project was finished. In fact, she was planning to celebrate it. On Friday morning, a banner appeared across the Ridgeview entrance. Ridgeview Tennis Club Grand Opening, Saturday, 10 a.m. White chairs arrived. A photographer was booked. A local real estate agent posted photographs online. Diane had chosen the exact place where she wanted everybody to see what she had accomplished. She had also chosen the exact place where every piece of evidence was sitting beneath her feet. Saturday morning was clear. By 9:47, more than 60 residents had gathered around the court. White folding chairs lined the fence. A photographer stood near the net. Someone had stretched a blue ribbon across the entrance. Diane wore a white blazer and held oversized ceremonial scissors. At exactly 10 o'clock, she stepped in front of the crowd. This project represents what Ridgeview can accomplish when we stop letting individual resistance stand in the way of progress. A few people applauded. Then she saw me near the back. Even Mark has to admit this looks better than a swamp. I said nothing. At 10:06, 2 government vehicles turned into the lot. No sirens. No flashing lights. 3 people stepped out carrying folders, cameras, and measuring equipment. The applause stopped. One of them walked directly to the edge of the tennis court. He checked a map, then the drainage line, then the exposed orange marker near the southeast corner. Diane approached. "Can I help you?" He introduced himself and asked who was responsible for construction. Diane lifted the HOA binder. This was an approved community improvement. He didn't look at the binder. Who authorized the placement of fill in this wetland? Her expression changed. The board approved remediation. The inspector looked down at roughly 8,000 square feet of asphalt, then back at Diane. "Show me the authorization." She opened the binder. Meeting minutes, budget sheets, contractor proposals, her emergency resolution. Nothing answering his question. The photographer lowered his camera. Nobody spoke. Then the inspector asked, "Do you have any permit or environmental authorization for this fill?" Diane looked toward the board members behind her. Not one of them stepped forward. I stayed where I was. Everything she needed to explain was already under her shoes. The inspector closed his folder. "Until we determine exactly what happened here, nobody touches this site." The ribbon was never cut. The inspection didn't end that morning. It started there. Over the next several weeks, each document Diane relied on was compared against the records she had ignored. First, the deed. The HOA did not own the land. Then the survey. The construction crossed deep into my parcel. Then the wetland records. The disturbed area matched the documented boundary. Then my camera footage. It showed North Ridge entering the property, workers identifying the marker, and Diane standing beside the operator before it disappeared under fill. Then Rachel's emails. Diane knew I had objected before construction. Finally, investigators had the message she sent while I was away. "Get the fill in before he comes back." At that point, North Ridge stopped protecting the HOA. Their attorney turned over project files, delivery tickets, work orders, and internal messages. The contractor had been told Ridgeview controlled the site. They had never been given my deed. They had never received an easement signed by me. And the environmental authorization Diane kept insisting must exist? Nobody could produce it. The court remained closed. Then the restoration requirements arrived. At 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, heavy equipment returned to my property. This time it wasn't there to build anything. A saw cut the asphalt into sections. The tennis nets came down. The fencing followed. Then an excavator pushed its bucket beneath the first slab. Black asphalt lifted into the air and cracked down the center. Underneath it were layers of crushed stone and compacted fill that had never belonged there. Truck by truck, it came back out. The grade was reconstructed. Drainage channels were reopened. Native wetland vegetation was scheduled for reestablishment and monitoring. And the bills kept arriving. Demolition, hauling, engineering, environmental consultants, legal fees, restoration, monitoring, penalties. By the time everything was combined, Ridgeview was facing more than $500,000 in penalties, remediation expenses, professional fees, and associated costs. The tennis court had been usable for less than 3 weeks. Diane had spent months calling it an investment in property values. Now the residents were looking at invoices for removing the project they had already paid to build. One morning, Tom stood beside me while another truck hauled broken asphalt away. "Feel good watching it come out?" I watched the excavator reach the dark soil beneath the final section. "No." He looked at me. "But it feels correct." Diane still believed she could explain everything at the emergency HOA meeting that night. What she didn't know was that Rachel had brought copies of every email. The meeting started at 7. Every chair in the community center was occupied. People stood along the back wall. Diane sat at the front table with the same binder she had carried to the tennis court. For 10 minutes, she blamed everyone except herself. The contractor, the board, outdated maps, confusing environmental rules, me. Then she said, "Everything I did was for this community." Rachel stood up. She was holding a folder. "No, the board needs to see the timeline." The room went silent. Rachel read the meeting minutes. There had never been a recorded vote authorizing construction on my parcel. Then she displayed Diane's instruction, telling North Ridge not to contact me because I had already objected. Tom confirmed Diane had been present when the first loads of fill arrived. Then Rachel projected the final email onto the wall. Everyone read it together. Mark will be out of state until next Thursday. Get the fill in before he comes back. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Diane finally said, "That sentence is being taken out of context." One board member leaned toward his microphone. What context makes that acceptable? That was the end of it. The questions came fast. Who authorized the invoices? Why had the cost increased from roughly $118,000 to more than $203,000? Why was the tennis court marketed before the property issue was resolved? Why were residents told the project was emergency remediation? And why had no one verified environmental approval before construction? By 8:41, the board voted to remove Diane as president, pending a full financial review. She closed her binder. For the first time since I had known her, nobody waited for her permission to speak. Over the following months, Ridgeview changed its approval process. Major projects required independent property verification. Special assessments required detailed disclosure. Environmental review became mandatory before work near wetlands or drainage areas. Board financial records were open to residents. My land stayed mine. I didn't donate it to Ridgeview. I didn't turn it into another community amenity. The wetland was restored, monitored, and left alone. The next spring, cattails returned. So did the frogs. After one heavy storm, I stood near the old boundary marker and watched runoff spread across the wetland, slow down, and settle exactly where it was supposed to. The road stayed dry. The houses downhill stayed dry. My father had been right. People usually notice wetlands after they're gone. I looked across the place where Diane's tennis court had stood. The asphalt was gone. The nets were gone. The sign was gone. All that remained was water, grass, and one orange boundary stake. Diane thought authority came from a title and a clipboard. It didn't. Sometimes authority is just a line on a survey, and sometimes ignoring that line costs $500,000. If an HOA can bury a protected wetland because one person thinks a clipboard outranks a property line, the problem is bigger than a tennis court. So tell me in the comments, what would you have done the moment you saw asphalt covering your land? And if you believe property rights, evidence, and the law should still mean something, subscribe. Because the next HOA story starts with an even smaller violation and ends with a much bigger bill.